Trapdoor. I'm Emily.
And I'm Katie.
And this is our podcast where we read you Harry Potter fan fiction.
Without tree noises.
For now. They might come back.
As of this moment, though, they're not here.
Yeah.
So it's been all of 5 minutes.
I have no life updates.
My life update of the day is, when I got here, I made Olivia cry just with my face. And she just let me hold her. So, progress.
Yes. To be fair, she also did that to her grandma when she saw her, Thursday and Friday, and to one of her aunts.
So, I think she's just going through the I don't know if I know you phase, and then she remembered she knew me, so it was okay.
Mm-hmm. All right. Continuing with chapter 14, The Alley and the Cottage. It was occurring to Mimi with a sinking heart that she and Remus might never be together. She'd run into him again, this time outside the leaky cauldron, and had seen that look in his eyes again. He always had this look of sorrow deep in the pits of his eyes, like he was always holding himself back from something, back from doing something or saying something that might bring him closer to Mimi than he wished. And Mimi was beginning to get so very tired of feeling lonely. It wasn't that she didn't have friends, she had plenty, but it was so very sad not to have someone to really look forward to seeing every day, to go to Hogsmeade with, to meet in a deserted classroom, and maybe have a bit of a nap on during the train ride.
You are 17. I know I can't say anything because I started dating my husband at 17, but you are 17.
Sometimes it takes longer to find your person. But at the same time, I do get just the want to have a boyfriend.
Yeah, I mean, I do get it. But she seems more like, I will never find love.
Yeah. Mimi really just enjoyed having a boyfriend, talking, kissing, slipping notes in class, taking prolonged walks around the lake, all those fantastic, happy, bubbly feelings she got when she was with someone she really cared about. 5th year had been the last time she had a serious boyfriend. 6th year, there hadn't really been much of anything. A couple dates to Hogsmeade, a couple good snog sessions, but nothing really serious. She felt that for 7th year, she'd really like to have something serious. At least, as serious as any relationships were at Hogwarts anyway. The most serious couple she knew was Lily and James, and they still refused to admit they were dating. Sure, there were other couples, but somehow they didn't seem quite as crazy about each other as Lord knew Lily and James were. She adored Remus. She knew that much anyway, and she was fairly certain he adored her, but she didn't know, and this is what bothered her the most, was how long she could stand to wait for him. Melody was vaguely aware of arms encircling her, of worried murmurs and gentle shakes of her shoulder, and a dish being set before her on a table, but everything was fuzzed and blurred and overshadowed by her tears. When Melody's mind finally cleared and her tears dissolved, she discovered that it was Lily who was attempting to hug her, however awkwardly, and suddenly, intense guilt flooded Melody's veins. How could she sit here, feeling so monumentally sorry for herself, and allow Lily to comfort her? How could she cry because she was protecting her family and look Lily, who'd lost her family, in the eye and complain? How could Melody be so selfish and Lily so selfless? What was wrong with her? Melody, are you all right? Lily demanded, her eyes clouded with worry, and Melody wanted to slap herself across the face. Of course she was all right. She was fine. She was dandy. Compared to Lily, she was bloody perfect. She had a bunch of siblings at home who loved her, a stepfather who'd die for her. Lily had an emotionally wrecked mother and a sister who hated her. Lily was being forced to deal with the most horrific experience ever, and Melody was falling to pieces because of a sodding wedding band.
I don't know, that's pretty,
life-altering.
Yeah, almost as much as losing your entire family.
I feel like Lily would get it.
Yeah, because your life is being completely ripped away from you without your choosing, just like hers was, just in a very different way.
Yes, she was still young, wasn't she? And who'd say she'd have to stay married to the rich bloke forever? Who was to say she couldn't get married, pay her uncle back, and then just divorce the bastard? Her uncle had said he didn't care if she stayed married, hadn't he? Hadn't he said something about murdering her husband on their wedding night to get straight to the money? So So it wouldn't be the worst thing ever, would it? Just a little nasty bargain, like a chunk of money, a little piece of her life, and then it would all be over and done with, and she'd never have to deal with her uncle again.
I mean, to be fair, you could just like marry some rich guy, not sign a prenup, be married to him for like 4 years, and then have a real messy divorce, and then just pay your uncle back with the settlement.
Yeah. Melody reached over and hugged Lily with all of her might, attempting to think not of herself but of her best friend. There were so many more important things in this world than Melody's sob stories. Better now? Lily ventured, and Melody nodded. We got you some ice cream. We thought you needed it. Melody glanced over at the dish of mint chocolate chip ice cream, smothered in fudge, and smiled. You're too fantastic for words, she told them, and then slid the dish closer to herself. Lily perched on the arm of Melody's chair and occasionally stole a bit of ice cream, which was fine by Melody as the sundae was huge and she was still feeling a bit queasy. So, you're going to tell your uncle to bugger off then? James wanted to know, and Lily kicked him under the table. Let's not talk about that right now, Lily suggested. Why not? James demanded, looking sulky and rubbing his shin. It's all right, Lily. I'm not really sure what I'm going to do, but considering the fit he just threw, I'm not sure bugger off would be exactly the right thing to put in an owl. It'd be funny, though, Sirius said. Melody smiled. Perhaps just a bit, she agreed. And then, quite unexpectedly, their table was attacked. Arabella Figg and Mundungus Fletcher descended upon them in a whirl of noise and shrieks and hugs and shopping bags, which they discovered after Mundungus had plopped himself in Lily's old chair and Arabella had situated herself on his lap, all belonged to Arabella, and stared enviously at Melody's sundae and ordered several for themselves. Okay.
Well, that's a pair.
That's a thing. That's a thing right there.
That's not a pair I would have put together.
Nope.
You know, the whole hitting him with a bag full of cat food.
Maybe that's why.
Ooh. Maybe there's some bad blood there.
Remus was a werewolf. That was just all there was to it. He'd been a werewolf today, he'd been a werewolf yesterday, and he'd be a werewolf tomorrow. That would never change. Luckily for Remus, he had 3 of the most fantastic friends in existence. Friends who didn't care he was a werewolf. Friends who'd do anything to help him out. Friends who would spend years in agonizing research and trial and error to become animagi. So he wouldn't have to face those horrid monthly transformations alone. They were his sanity, his sense of self on those moonlit nights, and he doubted very much if in all of his life he would find more wonderful people than them. Which is why, with terrible conviction, Remus was positive that he could never date Mimi Ramirez. It wasn't that she wasn't a fantastic person. Remus thought she was one of the most fantastic people he'd ever met. It was just, how do you explain being a werewolf to someone? Girls had a horrible habit of wanting to cure things, and there was no cure for being a werewolf. And if it wasn't curing things, it was taming them. And a werewolf couldn't be tamed either. At least not by a human. He'd seen it loads of times with stray dogs. Girls would try to befriend them, take them in, and they'd just be nasty animals, no matter what you did with them. Only the girls wouldn't see that until it was too late, and then they'd end up getting hurt. Who do you know that's taking in stray dogs that are mean?
Seriously. Most of the time, a stray dog is fairly kind once you've fed it and shown it love.
Yeah.
What kind of street dogs are these?
Where are you, Remus? I'm concerned.
Where are these street dogs from?
Who are these girls? I have many questions. And the last thing in the world Remus wanted to do was hurt Mimi. In fact, he was paralyzed, sometimes with the fear that one of those nights, one of those wonderful, reckless nights full of freedom and full moons and exploration, Sirius and James wouldn't be able to keep him in check, and that he'd run away from them all, untamable, and really hurt somebody. It almost happened once or twice, and they had laughed it off, because after all, no one had gotten hurt, but at the same time, it was still a fear Remus lived with. And though his friends were fantastic and they really didn't care that he was a werewolf, the fear was one thing they just wouldn't understand. It was something every werewolf had to live with, Remus suspected. Werewolves weren't bad people. They weren't really. And in fact, most of them were probably nicer than they had to be. The nicer you were, the less people suspected you of being something they feared. It always paid to be nice and smart and well-groomed. Sometimes it was very difficult to be well-groomed, but Remus tried anyway. He tried to, keeping his wits about him when he transformed. He tried not ripping things to shreds, scratching himself, biting himself, tearing the shrieking shack apart in agony, but it was impossible. When James and Sirius and Peter were there, though, it was easier. They weren't human, so he didn't have the mad urge to attack them, nor were they completely animal, which he could also sense as a werewolf, and knowing that triggered something in Remus's mind, which told him that he wasn't completely animal either. And that's why he allowed them to drag him around a bit, even when sometimes he might have preferred to stay holed up in the shrieking shack, safe from hurting anyone but himself. His worst fear was being responsible for turning someone else into a werewolf and forcing them to endure what he had every month. And so he couldn't let Mimi know. He couldn't date her. He didn't want to get close to her for fear that she'd find out. And he couldn't bear the thought of her suddenly hating him. He couldn't tell her for fear it would ruin what little relationship they had. He'd rather have her friendship from afar than hatred up close. Some little voice in his head told him that honesty was the best policy, and if she was a kind person who would judge him because he was a werewolf, then he wouldn't want to date her anyway. But another little voice in his head, a much stronger one, reminded him that in no uncertain terms that he didn't care if she was a kind person who would be repulsed by his condition as long as she didn't know. She could still be his friend, and in Remus's opinion, having her in his life, no matter what she really thought about werewolves, was better than all the honesty in the world.
Why does Remus always have his head up his ass?
I honestly don't know. One, you're not very subtle.
You're really not, honey.
Like, really, anybody who paid attention to you for more than 5 minutes could probably figure out that you're a werewolf.
Like, come on.
I mean, Hermione figured it out after, 3 moon cycles?
Yes.
So, literally anybody can figure it out if you give them a long enough opportunity.
Seriously, the only reason Harry didn't figure it out is because he is a brick wall.
Literally can't see anything.
It has to literally be spelled out in front of his face, and even then.
Speaking of that, how many times do you think Mrs. Weasley walked around behind him shouting magical referring words behind Harry before he noticed that she was like, "Oh, and what's the platform number again?"
Seriously.
She has how many children? 7?
And they're all redheads.
They're all redheads. They've all gone to Hogwarts at this point. She went to Hogwarts herself. She knows what the platform number is. She's not asking her children.
No.
She was shouting that for Harry.
She was 100% shouting that for Harry. Because she 100% noticed this poor 11-year-old alone in a train station just going... With an owl.
Yeah, with an owl. Honestly. How many other random things do you think she shouted behind him and made her children walk back and forth? Because obviously she couldn't just walk up and be like, "Are you looking for platform 9 3/4? It's right over here. Let me take you."
Seriously. Because she kind of had to, okay, if I just shout enough, is he going to pay attention and then follow us? Or, no? Okay. Let's try that again. No. Okay.
Yeah. That's exactly what had to happen. Mrs. Potter was feeling quite chatty. She wanted to know how they'd liked Diagon Alley, what they'd all like for dinner, how their night on the town had gone, who those people they were talking to at Florine Fortescue's were. The teenagers had a jumbo mix of answers for her, but mostly the gist had been Diagon Alley was fine as usual, fish and chips sounded good for dinner, the club had been fantastic, and they'd been talking to Arabella and Mundungus, Gryffindor Quidditch players. Mrs. Potter's questioning did not provoke only grumbling and thoughtless answers, however. When they mentioned the nightclub, Lily's mind immediately flew to the mysterious Frenchman, and her hand flew to her necklace. Mrs. Potter, do you know anything about jewelry collectors? Mrs. Potter laughed. I've had a fair argument with them a time or two. They always ask me about the ancient family jewels, Gryffindors, you know, and I have to keep telling them that the jewels simply don't exist anymore. Some of them were melted down to make other things, some of them were sold to museums a long time ago, and some, as ancient things do, simply went missing or got carried out of the family over time. But I'm sure that's all very boring to you. No, not at all, Lily insisted. So do you know a bit about jewelry and all that, then? Oh, no, dear, not really. Just that I don't really have anything worth selling, that's all. Oh, Lily said, somewhat disappointed, fiddling with her necklace. Why do you ask? Well, she paused, hesitating, and then glancing over at Melody, and then James and Sirius, briefly wondering how, just to explain, Melody saved her by jumping in and telling the story. When we were at the club, the owner called me and Lily up to his office, she began, and Mrs. Potter looked rather shocked. He asked us, well, not us, but Lily, about Lily's necklace. He said he was a collector of fine jewelry and was inquiring about buying it. He wanted to buy that? Mrs. Potter asked, bewildered. Not that it isn't a perfectly good necklace, dear, but, well, it's not exactly out of the ordinary now, is it? Lily nodded in agreement. That's exactly why we were confused. There are thousands of necklaces like this one. Why would a jewelry collector want it? The only thing we could think, Melody continued, is that it might be magical, or might have belonged to Gryffindor himself at one point. Although that didn't really make much sense, Lily added, as it looks so new. Well, Mrs. Potter said slowly, James, that is the necklace that used to belong to your grandmother, isn't it? The one you gave Lily last Christmas? Yes, Mum, James said. That necklace did belong to Christopher's mother, but as far as I know, she just had it. Maybe as a present from her husband, but she never really talked about it. It was just some kind of heirloom. Maybe the collector just had the wrong necklace, Sirius suggested. Maybe he was really looking for something else. But why be looking for anything like this at all, Lily pointed out. Whether or not he had the right necklace, I want to know what he was looking for. He did mention that he didn't think many people knew of the necklace's value, Melody said, so maybe he had been right about Lily's necklace being worth something, and he might not have. But I agree with Lily. I really want to know what he was talking about. Mrs. Potter said, considering, and then she was silent for a moment. Well, like I said, I know Christopher's mother never really spoke of it as any kind of heirloom, but it's still possible. You can poke around in the library a bit if you really want to. The library... Mom, didn't you cloak that up for the New Year's ball? James asked. Oh, that's right, I did, but, well, it shouldn't be too much of a problem. The ballroom's all cloaked up again. If you all want to look around, I can uncloak it for you. Wait, what? Lily asked, confused. This wasn't the first time she'd been confused about Potter's Cottage. After years of visiting, she was determined to uncover all the mystery and magic the cottage was so obviously shrouded in. We can't have everything uncloaked at once, you know. It's a bit dangerous. So we keep a good count. Mostly it's the house elves, really, of the bits we have uncloaked and the bits we don't. It helps keep everything nice and orderly. Lily exchanged a glance with Melody, who looked equally confused. Mrs. Potter, they said in unison, and they glanced at each other, and Lily continued, We have no idea what you're talking about. Mrs. Potter looked at them, blinked, and then realization dawned on her eyes. You mean James hasn't told you why it's called Potter Cottage? Lily and Melody both shook their heads, and Mrs. Potter's eyes widened. Well, she said, and she scooted her chair a bit closer to the kitchen table, around which they were all seated. It's a small bit of story, but I say it's time you heard it. Only I think this calls for a spot of tea.
I love her.
She's fantastic.
Well...
At that, the table blossomed with teacups and saucers and a nice large tea kettle ready to be poured, along with biscuits and crumpets and such. Mrs. Potter directed the teapot to pour itself with a simple flick of her wand. As soon as she had a nice steaming cuppa in front of her, she launched into the explanation of how Potter's Cottage had gotten its name. Long ago, during the time of the founders, she began taking a sip of her tea. Godric Gryffindor, a brilliant warrior, set out to build a fortress. He'd come from a wealthy wizarding family, but they'd lived hidden in a Muggle city, and Gryffindor decided he wanted to have his own home, far from any prying Muggle eyes. He began his project after inheriting his parents' wealth, but was destined never to finish it. Halfway through building the fortress, he met Rowena Ravenclaw, a brilliant witch who was just beginning to make a name for herself in the wizarding world. Gryffindor's longtime friend Salazar Slytherin quickly became friends with Rowena as well, and the three began talking of the ways in which to improve wizarding society. Shortly after the idea of building the school for wizards came into their heads, they met Helga Hufflepuff, who was the oldest of the lot, though not by much, and easily the most famous of her age. You know the rest of the story of Hogwarts from there. Together they founded and built the first and best wizarding school of all of Europe. The construction of Hogwarts took many, many years and many, many galleons to complete, and Gryffindor was never able to complete his fortress. As the years passed, however, he did gain several other very important things: a wife and several daughters and sons. One of these sons, Gildrick, was a brilliant businessman, and he used his share of the family fortune to create another family fortune. He alone among his brothers and sisters was interested in finishing the project his father started, and took it upon himself to create an immense fortress, partly to live in, but mostly to be used if the time of war ever broke out. The fortress was designed half in Muggle terms, half in wizarding terms, with large stone walls and barricades, as well as permanent defense spells to protect it. It was the height of engineering at the time, and the height of powerful wizardry. Many of the spells employed in Potter's Cottage were similar or identical to those placed on Hogwarts for its protection of students. The fortress was originally named Gryffindor's Castle, though only those of the Gryffindor line inhabited its walls. It was originally intended for much greater purpose than day-to-day living. Gildrick wanted it to be a refuge for all those needed during times of war. He wanted it to be a strategically placed defense fortress, to be used for the protection of wizards, the training of armies, and the headquarters for any and all wizarding wars past and present. As you can imagine, wars were far more violent and frequent in those days than they are now, and Gryffindor's castle was, for centuries, used just as Gildrick and, in all fairness, Godric had originally intended it. However, over the years, the fortress became too large and cumbersome to handle. Wars were becoming less and less frequent, at least the ones that required full-scale combat, and the population of Britain increased. So the open space around Gryffindor's castle diminished. Before long, the castle was too close to prying Muggle eyes, and far too big a structure to, first of all, be maintained by the Gryffindors alone, and secondly, to be made unplottable. Of course, knowing that Hogwarts is unplottable, this might sound unrealistic, but what you must understand is that Godric's castle was positively enormous. It was also the Gryffindors who owned the castle at the time were not capable of such complex magic. Other, more talented wizards did not quite see the need for this one mostly unused structure to take up so much space, and refused to perform the unplottable spell on it, telling the Gryffindors to come up with a better solution. What the Gryffindors decided was this: they did not want to leave their home, nor did they want to inhabit all of it. They agreed that it had become obsolete as a military headquarters, but were unwilling to tear it down. They decided that rather than destroying part of their home or trying to make it unplottable, they would simply employ a string of cloaking spells to hide bits and pieces of the castle from view, and consequently from touch. When a room is cloaked, it is not only unseeable but also unreachable and untouchable. The cloaking spell, were it to be employed over half the castle at large, would be one of the most complex spells in existence. However, since the Gryffindors of the time were not talented enough to employ such a large spell, they decided to cloak each room individually, and sometimes, as later residents of the castle discovered, put more than one cloaking spell on a particular room, and in this way remove most of their castle from existence. As time went on, more and more of the castle became cloaked. Certain generations of Gryffindors would be larger than others, and so bits and pieces of the castle became uncloaked as necessary. After so many centuries, however, the castle living became obsolete. The castle had no running water, no indoor bathrooms, too many windows, not enough fireplaces for people who were more accustomed to modern living. New parts of the castle were built. Though the Gryffindors no longer desired to live in most of the old castle, they still wished to keep the structure in the family. Certain parts they left uncloaked. The ballroom, for example, the library. It was lucky they had to, otherwise they might have discovered unpleasantly some of the consequences of cloaking magic the earlier Gryffindors had so conspicuously imparted on their castle. As later generations discovered, the cloaking magic only worked as long as parts of the castle still remained uncloaked. Attempting to cloak all of the rooms would nullify the effects of the spell, and the entire thing would be visible again. In this way, the Gryffindors discovered that to keep most of the castle hidden, at least some of it had to be uncloaked. So by building onto the castle, the Gryffindors were able to keep all of the original castle cloaked and only the new part of the castle uncloaked. However, to prevent the spell from becoming undone, the Gryffindors had laid down a rule that any new additions to the castle had to be attached to the original Gryffindor's castle in at least 3 places. That is, they wanted anyone who built a new addition to be able to easily access 3 rooms in Gryffindor's castle from their new addition. The other rule was that at least one of these rooms had to remain uncloaked at all times to prevent the spell from undoing itself. Whew, that's still very confusing.
I'm so confused.
The place we're living in, the home we call Potter's Cottage, is actually quite small compared to the original monstrous fortress, especially if you consider all the other additions that have been made over time. If you care to look for it, there's a map in the library of the entire structure, all of the additions that have been made over the years, the original fortress, that sort of thing. Anyway, this part of the castle was constructed after the Gryffindor name fell out of the family. Potter became the primary surname for the last remaining descendants of the Gryffindors about 2 centuries ago, and the Potter who built this particular addition lived only about 80 years ago. This is the most modern part of the castle, and actually connected to the rest of the castle in more places than the rest of the additions. The library, the ballroom, the trophy room, even a couple of the bedrooms were all original parts of the Gryffindor castle, and that's why we had to keep track of how many we have cloaked and uncloaked. We don't like to have too many uncloaked at once, as it sets an uneven balance on the whole cottage. The man who built the addition decided to name it Potter's Cottage because none of the additions had yet been named after a Potter, and because he thought the name was both amusing and fitting at the same time. And, well, here we are. Mrs. Potter finished brightly, finishing off her 3rd cup of tea. Melody and Lily looked at each other, rather surprised. They had certainly not expected that to be Mrs. Potter's small bit of story. James looked partly interested, but mostly bored, as though he'd heard the story too many times before to be very interested in it. Sirius was distinctly more interested-looking than James, but not half as interested as Melody and Lily. "Wow," Lily said after a moment. "That's a fantastic bit of history." "Well, I've always liked the story," Mrs. Potter beamed. "Now then, how about I uncloak the library for you, and you can see if you can't find anything on that necklace of yours. I'll send a house elf up with you. The house elves are fantastic at finding books and things." Lily nodded in agreement, and then all the teenagers rose from the table. James looked slightly glad to be standing, but not so enthralled at the idea of spending an evening nosing through the library looking for something about Lily's necklace. He was flattered, of course, that she wore it so often and always went around playing with it, and that someone thought it was valuable, but really, he thought the Frenchman from the club was a bit off his rocker. And mostly the fact that the necklace meant so much to Lily that he had propelled himself into the library and began looking through old, dusty library volumes for some kind of hint as to the origin of Lily's necklace. Lily, James, Sirius, and Melody got nowhere. There didn't seem to be anything useful in the library pertaining to the necklace, at least not textbook-wise. They were at a bit of a loss as to what to do next. Going through library volumes was so boring, tedious, rather dusty, sneezy work, and mostly they kept at it because none of them felt like they were doing a very good job of flipping through the books and felt that if they at least kept looking, they might fall on a stroke of good luck. Even though the work was tedious, interesting things did happen in the library. For instance, the day before they were supposed to catch the Hogwarts train at King's Cross, Lily and James happened to be working very close together, and they kept getting a bit distracted by each other. Their hands would brush together, James's arms would bump into Lily's. Lily would accidentally trot on James's feet, or sometimes James decided to tuck a stray piece of hair behind Lily's ear, and Lily would ruffle James's hair. It got to the point where neither of them could really concentrate on their work anymore, and Melody rolled her eyes and told them to get a room, and James decided to ask Lily if she cared to go look something up with him, and he grabbed her hand and led her to the back of the library. Lily did not waste time asking James any stupid questions about why they happened to be in the very back of the library, but instead pulled him against her, opened her mouth against his, and from there their time in the library was a bit of a fuzzy blur. A mixture of safely exploring hands and deep, long kisses and fiery little fluttering kisses on the neck and the throat and the jawbone. Though it was a bit useless during this time, really. What was there to think about? There was just Lily and James and the intoxicating scent of James filling Lily's nose and his taste on her lips, and his feel ran through her hands, and the sound of his breathing and his kissing fluttered in her ears. The only thing she didn't need was sight. Her eyes fluttered open and closed, but all the sensations became that much more intense if she let her eyes remain shut. Lily had never realized how much people kissed or how long people kissed before she had taken up kissing James. Most of James's early attempts at kissing Lily had failed miserably and ended up with slaps across the face, which Lily knew now had been extremely foolish. Instead, "Don't bite the hand that feeds you," Lily mused. The phrase should be, "Don't slap the mouth that kisses you," because honestly, Lily was beginning to discover that there were very few things in the world she enjoyed more than kissing James. Of course, she couldn't think of what they were right now, but she's sure that they existed, didn't they? Oh dear, this wasn't a good sign. There had to be something she enjoyed better than kissing James. After all, she couldn't spend her entire day kissing him, could she? Because if she could, that would be fantastic. And oh no, I shouldn't be thinking about spending entire days kissing James. I shouldn't. And I shouldn't be thinking about spending entire days with James for other reasons. This shouldn't be happening. I shouldn't be thinking about him all the time. I shouldn't be with him all the time. I shouldn't be kissing him. No. I can't. We can't. I can't do that. I can't be that attached to him.
You can, and you are.
Lily's thought process froze for a moment as James trailed a long line of kisses along her collarbone, up her neck, and along her jawbone before finally catching her lips in a long, deep, slow kiss. Lily's pulse jumped. Blood rushed to her face, pounded against her ears. She couldn't think. She could hardly breathe. She couldn't begin to decipher all the emotions running through her. She felt lightheaded, very dizzy in a very good way, and happy, so happy, and warm and safe, and there weren't even words. The only thing she could think was to transfer all of her emotions, all of her bubbly, lightheaded, insane, hormonal happiness to James through another insane kiss. But that only served to make more bubbly, lightheaded hormones explode inside her head, And as the feeling rushed through her, her stomach did flip-flops and her heart beat chaos against her ribs. Something very, very frightening occurred to her, and amidst all the happy, bubbly, amazing feelings, Lily Evans froze. James, because he's not an idiot, noticed. Reluctantly, he separated his lips from hers, breathing a bit unevenly and holding Lily a bit more tightly than she expected. He focused his brown eyes after a moment on Lily's green ones, and she looked up at him, breathing a bit oddly herself, with a fair amount of confusion and a small bit of shock, the fear churning inside her. Hopefully, James not able to sense all this by looking in her eyes. Something significant had just occurred to Lily, and she felt that she couldn't continue her rather brilliant snog session with James until she'd fully confirmed and processed this fact. She looked up at him and studied his face for a moment, tracing her fingers along his forehead and his cheeks and then his jawbone before allowing them to gently slide off his chin. "What?" James asked. And even just that did strange things to Lily's intoxicating emotions. She'd come to several rock-solid, rather frightening conclusions. She was not in love with James, but she was falling in love with him very, very hard.
So sweet.
Oh, I'm so glad that she finally got there.
I know, it took her long enough.
All right, well, I think we're going to wrap it up there, and we will see you again next week.
See you next week.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much for joining us on our journey through the trapdoor.
You can leave us a review on Facebook or Apple Podcasts. It would literally mean the world to us.
Or you can find us on Twitter and Instagram at thetrapdoor16.
Or if you have any longer thoughts, you can shoot us an email at throughthetrapdoor16@gmail.com.
Thank you so much, and we'll see you again next week.
See you next week.